An Orbiting Human Circus Special, the Second Imaginary Symphony. Thank you so much to Audible for supporting the Second Imaginary Symphony. Audible is offering you a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial. Just go to audible.com/OHC and check out orbitinghumancircus.com/shop for 2 new Second Imaginary Symphony t-shirt designs featuring Julian's artwork, available only through July 6th. And now, this is episode 3.
August here, this is the Perpetual Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome to our broadcast of Part 3 of the Second Imaginary Symphony, and of course, to Week 3 of our lead-up to Platypus Eve. Tonight being the night, of course, when all Paris spills into platypus-shaped seacraft, in many cases passed down from parents or grandparents, and float upon the Seine, sharing delicious nighttime picnics. But of course, you don't need me to tell you, you're probably pulling your boat out of your basement or boathouse right now. And while you shore up your craft and patch up the holes, like all the rest of us, you'll be listening to Part 3 of the Second Imaginary Symphony broadcast right here on the Perpetual Broadcasting Corporation. And last week, our cloud maker disappeared. We return you now to the story moments before we last left. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Second Imaginary Symphony.
This is getting me nowhere, thought Nye, who with a great sigh of relief decided to resume his search for Mr. Ackerman outside. On his way to the door, however, Nye found himself suddenly tumbling forward, falling face first to the floor. And there, beneath his feet, lay the culprit, the infamous large yellow raincoat with its inch of undisturbed dust. Retrieving the raincoat and straightening the coat rack from which it had fallen, Nye heard the unmistakable sound of distant thunder. Oh no, he thought. Rain would be of no help at all. Nye poked his head outside to find that indeed it had begun raining, and soon it became quite apparent that this was no ordinary rainstorm. With each passing moment, the rain fell harder and the wind blew stronger, until what had begun as a pleasant sprinkle had become no less than a torrential downpour. In his mission, however, Nye would not be discouraged. Mr. Ackerman might be in trouble, and if this was the case, it would be with the bravery and strength of the most grown-up of grown-ups anywhere that Nye would strive to find him. And so out into the storm Nye went, protected only by an ill-fitting large yellow raincoat that he now wore. All around Nye, the skies grew darker and darker until not the tiniest trace of sunlight remained. Huge tornadoes began to gather upon the horizons, their deafening winds so loud that Nye was unable to hear the sound of his grandmother calling for him to come home. Spiraling raindrops filled the air, turning the earth to mud and flooding the streets all about him. And then suddenly, a tremendous gust of wind came along, blowing Nye off his feet and blowing the open raincoat right off of him. Nye looked up from his seat in a puddle and was astonished by what he saw. The moment the raincoat had blown off of him, the rain had stopped and the sun came out. There were chirping birds, and all shone with the warm glow of a clear sky, as the powerful cumulus clouds that had been pounding the earth with its torrential downpour just a moment ago had all but withdrawn. Nye looked at the raincoat, which was now strewn on the ground a few feet in front of him, and looked back up at the sky. He got up, went to retrieve the raincoat, but as soon as he touched it, he found the sky darkening and the distant sound of thunder again returning. He took his hand off the raincoat and found that the sun had once again come out. He repeated this several times and found that every time his hand made contact with the coat, the cumulus clouds were once again drawn to fill the sky, and the moment he released the coat, the clouds withdrew. This was another of Mr. Ackerman's possessions, Nye decided, that should only be touched by trained and authorized personnel. He reached for a small branch that in the storm had been blown off of a nearby tree, and with it lifted the raincoat carefully and returned it to Mr. Ackerman's wooden coat rack. Then a thought occurred to Nye. What if early that morning there had been some sort of emergency at the cloud factory, one that required Mr. Ackerman's immediate attention? An emergency of such great importance that he was unable to pause for a moment, not even to close the front door or retrieve the fallen hat and briefcase that he had dropped in his haste. If such had been the case, then Mr. Ackerman would certainly appreciate having his hat and briefcase brought to him. Certainly he would, thought Nye. And so, Nye climbed to the top of the big hill, Mr. Ackerman's hat and briefcase in hand, and looked down at the great factory as he had done so many times before. He knew he'd never get past the guards at the front gate. At best, they would simply take the hat and briefcase from him and then send him on his way. Nye wanted to see that Mr. Ackerman was all right with his own two eyes, and to see inside the cloud factory more than almost anything in the whole wide world. He had discovered some time ago that around the back of the factory there was a small hole at the base of the barbed wire fence, just the right size for a skinny 9-year-old boy to fit through. Nye made his way carefully down the hill, so as not to slip on the wet grass, and climbed quietly through the hole, pulling the hat and briefcase behind him. The factory consisted of 2 tall silver buildings, one rectangle and one square, connected at the center by another giant bubble-shaped building, roughly double the size of the others. The whole of the structure was covered from top to bottom in long lines of blinking lights and lighted windows. It looked to Nye like a giant version of the old recording equipment that his grandmother kept in their basement. Looking up at the smokestacks, Nye wondered if he had ever seen anything quite so tall. Standing right up next to them for the first time, he had certainly never felt smaller. Just then, Nye heard the sound of voices and footsteps coming from somewhere nearby. He looked around for some place to hide, but could see none. Moving along the back of the great structure, he came to a single unmarked door and gave its knob a try. The door was unlocked, and Nye, hearing the voices and footsteps draw nearer, slowly and quietly cracked the door open and stepped inside. What Nye saw then was at once the most amazing and beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. Rows of singing, white-haired women sitting on a vast and spiraling assembly line. In front of each, a small and perfectly formed cloud, floating only inches above a frost-covered silver tray. Men cranking cranks and pulling levers upon huge machines made of silver and bronze. Hundreds of workers suspended in midair by string, pulleys, and wire, pedaling upon small contraptions whose pedals and gears were linked to bigger gears, and those to bigger gears, and those to bigger gears yet. Above them, giant fans blowing the larger completed clouds toward smokestacks high along the factory's vast lighted ceiling, creating huge cloud-shaped shadows that drifted over the men and women working 100 feet below. He saw several raised platforms upon which sat workers surrounded by huge control panels of blinking and flashing lights, buttons and knobs of every imaginable size and color, frost-covered golden tubs housing hundreds of tiny floating clouds waiting for inspection. Suspended from the ceiling, a giant clock of a sort that he had never seen before, flanked on all sides by a towering bank of gauges and meters. And rising out of it all, on the tallest platform yet, he saw the elder Cloudmaker, who from his perch high above directed the flow of the entire factory with graceful waves of his left hand while calling out through the megaphone in his right. Nimbus, 200 of 3,000. Stratus, 44 of 53. Cumulus, 27 of 413. and on and on. Nye realized that he had begun to shiver, and noticed also that he could see his breath. Looking around at the singing, silver-haired women seated all about him, Nye noticed that their breath could be seen as well. In fact, upon closer inspection, it almost looked as if the women were singing the clouds before them. Putting on Mr. Ackerman's large hat and crossing his arms against the chill, Nye proceeded to look about the building for any sign of Mr. Ackerman. He noticed that every single chair in the building seemed to be filled, with the exception of one, and that this one empty chair seemed to be the focus of many an anxious glance by the workers in its midst. Even the elder cloudmaker, directing the whole factory from his platform high above, was seen to glance worriedly at this empty chair from time to time. Indeed, this chair, located high atop the only empty examination platform, seemed to be a matter of great concern to all the cloudmakers. Crawling his way along the factory's back wall so as not to be noticed, Nye made his way slowly but surely to the platform in question. He waited silently until he was sure no one was looking, and climbed slowly up to the platform's top. Peeking over the edge, Nye could clearly see a silver plaque, bolted to the back of the empty chair. And etched upon this silver plaque, he could clearly see, was the name R.A. Ackerman. Nye suddenly became quite aware that every sound in the factory had ceased and had been replaced with a shocked and deathly silence. Looking up, he saw that all work in the factory had come to a stop, and that every last eye in the vast building was upon him. "A little boy?" boomed the elder cloudmaker, who in his shock did not realize that he was still speaking through the megaphone. Several of the cloudmakers began slowly to rise to their feet, and Nye, now aware that he might be in terrible trouble, collected the briefcase and ran as fast as he could towards the door through which he had entered. Finding the door still unlocked, Nye made a hasty exit, not looking back even once outside. Hearing a growing commotion behind him, he made his way to the gate and squeezed himself back to the small hole. Once through, he ran as fast as he could up the hill and to the road just beyond it. At just that moment, a fire engine with its lights flashing slowly turned the corner and began sounding its alarm, having just pulled out of the engine house. The firemen on board were under the luring influence of the fire siren and did not notice the small boy as he climbed on board. Nye hid himself underneath one of the fire engine's big benches and, exhausted by the day's adventures, drifted off to sleep. He awoke a good time later to find a wet and motley group of firemen looking down at him. "Don't you know that fire engines are dangerous places for little boys?" asked a fireman with a kind face. "You could have been hurt. What's your name?" "Nye," said Nye. "You mustn't ever go near a fire engine when it's in use, Nye. Now, if you were to come by the engine house some afternoon, that'd be a different story. Why, me and the boys, we'd even give you a tour. But when we're fighting a fire, that's business only for a trained firefighter. And even trained firefighters die fighting fires. Do you understand, Nye?" Nye nodded yes, and the fireman smiled. "Someday, Nye, you might even grow up to be a real fireman, just like us." Though he tried not to show it, Nye shuddered inwardly at the thought of being forever subject to the whims of the fire siren. "Where do you live, Nye?" the fireman asked. Nye looked up to see where he was, and saw in the afternoon light that the truck had traveled rather far from Telegraph Road. However, not wanting to answer too many more questions about his day's activities, Nye pointed to a spot vaguely down the block. "Well, you head on home now, Nye." Relieved, Nye stepped down from the fire truck. "Oh, and Nye, where did you get the hat and briefcase from?" They're my father's," said Nye. The fireman smiled, and with that the engine was off, leaving Nye standing alone on a street corner. Realizing that he had a very long walk ahead of him, Nye started for home. As he walked, he reflected upon the day's events and became more and more concerned that something horrible really had become of Mr. Ackerman. Soon the day began to turn slowly into night, and Nye noticed that though he had been walking for quite some time in the direction of home, things were looking less and less familiar, until soon they were no longer familiar at all. Nye realized that he was lost, and in a part of town that he had never been to before. The buildings loomed larger and somehow grayer, with dark alleys that spread like vast spider webs between them. There were more and more grown-ups everywhere, all rushing to and fro with haste and impatience. Nye was becoming worried that he might never find his way home. He had walked a long, long way, and his legs were aching as it was. He knew one thing for sure. He was tired, and did not much like this new part of town in which he had found himself. Nye sat down on a curb to rest his legs for a moment, and was almost tripped over by a large businessman who had been rushing past. "Watch where you're sitting, little boy," scolded the cross businessman, who dusted himself off and continued on his way. Not wanting to be tripped over again, Nye gathered himself up and entered one of the nearby alleys. At least here there would be less traffic and he could rest. The alley was dark, and Nye, moving carefully so as not to bump into anything, settled against the wall of the building, finding a nice soft spot on which to rest his head. It was now almost completely dark, and as night settled on this strange part of the city, Nye found the sounds coming from outside of the alley to be more violent and foreboding. Drunken sounds, bottles smashing, and men fighting. Wild laughter that offered not a hint of happiness. Nye wished more than anything to be safe and at home with Grandma. He realized that he was hungry, and that Grandma had probably had his dinner ready long ago. He knew also that once the dinner time had come and passed, she would have begun to worry. Nye promised himself that he would take only a short rest and then immediately continue on his journey home. And it was with this conviction that Nye's already heavy eyelids became altogether too heavy to lift at all, and Nye fell once again into the deepest and most pleasant of sleeps. What Nye did not know as he drifted off to the land of dreams was that the soft object he had come to rest against was not a bundle of rags, nor a waste paper bag. In fact, it was not an object at all. It was a man. A very tired and sleeping man by the name of Rudolph Abacus Ackerman. In a matter of moments now, Nye and his friend Mr. Ackerman will awaken and discover each other in the morning light. But let us first take a moment to discover for ourselves the difference between the sound of a sunrise on Telegraph Road, as we experienced at the beginning of our adventure, and the sound of a sunrise on the streets of a sleepless city, as the first rays of morning light glitter peacefully upon the empty silver flask in Mr. Ackerman's outstretched hand.
You've been listening to the PBC's broadcast of the Second Imaginary Symphony. Do be careful not to tip your boats, and we'll see you tonight on the Seine.
Thanks again to Audible for helping us bring the Second Imaginary Symphony to you. Audible has an unmatched selection of audiobooks, original shows, news, comedy, and more. And audiobooks are perfect to listen to when you're stuck inside because an escaped polar bear is roaming the Parisian streets. Audible is offering you a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial at audible.com/OHC. I'm listening to Men Without Women by Haruki Murakami, a collection of stories that explore loneliness and loss and life's strangeness. To listen to this book or anything else available on Audible, go to audible.com/OHC for a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial. That's audible.com/OHC. The Second Imaginary Symphony is written, directed, and audio produced by Julian Koster, performed by Brian DeWan, and produced for podcasting by Christy Gressman, with Augustus Plum as himself, Second Imaginary Symphony music by Julian Koster and the Music Tapes, and Perpetual Broadcasting Corporation music by Thomas Hughes. For more information, go to orbitinghumancircus.com or search for Orbiting Human Circus on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. The Orbiting Human Circus is part of the Night Vale Presents network. To learn more, go to nightvalepresents.com.